Thank you everyone for joining this COVID-19 conference, COVID-19 in the Americas conference. This conference will last for 6 months. It's starting today, and this is the first panel after the opening remarks related with the structure of the conference. So this is the first panel on rethinking everything. And this panel will be moderated by Dr. Felicia Knaul. She's the director of the Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas, which is part of the University of Miami. And we are very pleased to have this high-level panelist, and we're very pleased also to have Felicia accepting, but not just accepting, because she's one of the co-organizers of the entire conference, to moderate this panel. So I will leave it to you, Felicia, so I don't take more time, and I'll leave it to you and the panelists, of course.
Jorge, thank you so much. And thank you for all the work that you've done and all the work that you're doing to make this gargantuan initiative begin today and proceed over the next 6 months. On behalf of the University of Miami, I want to thank you all for attending, and particularly to thank the Global Public Health Institute, which is based at the University of Miami, as well as IAPAC, the International Association of Providers of AIDS Care, for all of the support and for co-organizing and working with us as an institution to make this event and others come forward in the future. I have the distinct pleasure and challenge of moderating 2 amazing individuals in global health. I'll just start us off by saying that our panel today lets us go anywhere we would like. It's about rethinking everything. I'd like to have us think about rethinking everything in the context of what Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, has been writing about, saying that, in fact, we are living not a pandemic, but a syndemic, a confluence of pandemics. We've got layered pandemics, NCDs, non-communicable diseases, on top of COVID-19, exacerbated by underlying social conditions, including poverty, inequity, forced migration, and discrimination based on gender, race, ethnicity, and color. In that context, COVID-19 has affected every single aspect of our lives, directly or indirectly. Going back to the normal we knew before is not possible. We have a chance of moving forward, and we're going to be speaking today, thanks to our 2 panelists, about the lessons that we've learned. And I'd really like us to focus on the opportunities for building back better, and particularly for building our national, regional, and global health institutions back better. Let me now present the panelists. First, Dr. Julio Frank, a 4th-generation physician whose paternal grandparents fled Germany in the early 1930s to build a life in Mexico. Julio has catalyzed his deep gratitude for the kindness of strangers into a lifelong mission to improve the health, education, and well-being of people around our world. He became the 6th president of the University of Miami in August of 2015 and holds additional academic appointments as professor of public health sciences at the Leonard M. Miller School of Medicine and at the Business School. Prior to joining the University of Miami, Dr. Frenk was the dean for nearly 7 years at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the T.N.G. Angelopoulos Professor of Public Health and International Development with a joint appointment with the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He served as Minister of Health of Mexico from 2000 to 2006 and pursued an ambitious agenda to reform the nation's health system, introducing the Seguro Popular, which managed to cover more than 55 million people previously without access to insurance. He was the founding Director General of the National Institute of Public Health of Mexico, Executive Director of Evidence and Information for Policy at the World Health Organization, and a Senior Fellow at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Frenk holds a medical degree from the National University of Mexico, a Master's of Public Health, and a joint PhD from the University of Michigan, and has honorary degrees from 10 universities. His scholarly production, which includes over 170 articles in academic journals, as well as many books and book chapters, has over 19,000 citations. In addition, he's written 3 best-selling novels for youngsters explaining the functions of the human body. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, and the National Academy of Medicine of Mexico, as well as being an elected member of the Colegio Nacional. He serves on the boards of the United Nations Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and has numerous recognitions, including the Clinton Global Citizen Award. The rest of this CV I know quite well, since I work very closely with him, and I'll move now to welcome also our panelist, Dr. Michael Weinstein. Michael Weinstein is the president of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, known as AHF, the largest global AIDS organization. Before becoming involved in HIV/AIDS related issues in the 1980s, he was a business person and graphic designer. Since 1986, Mr. Weinstein has been a leader in the fight against HIV and AIDS. As president and co-founder of AHF, he oversees a multi-billion-dollar organization whose mission is to provide cutting-edge medicine and advocacy regardless of ability to pay. AHF currently serves over 1 million clients in the United States, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the Asia-Pacific region, and Eastern Europe. Under his leadership, AHF has grown from a group of friends dedicated to the creation of dignified care for people in the last stages of AIDS to the largest AIDS organization in the United States. The foundation now operates in over 500 treatment clinics in more than 40 countries globally, as well as in many parts of the United States. AHF also operates more than 46 pharmacies in over 10 states and clinical research unit. Under its positive healthcare brand, AHF operates managed care programs for people living with HIV and or AIDS in California and Florida, which currently serves almost 5,000 clients. So we have an incredible background of service in government, in international global health institutions, and in not-for-profits and global NGOs, and then also in academia. It's an amazing way to start this panel. And I'd like to start with a question that gives you a chance to make some opening remarks to start. Today's panel is about rethinking everything. And so where do we see opportunities in health and healthcare to build back better? Julio, would you like to start?
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you to Jorge Saavedra and Jose Shepopnik for this grand initiative. I'm also delighted to be sharing the panel with Michael Weinstein and the very strong partnership we've built with the AIDS Healthcare Foundation here at the University of Miami to pursue some of these major initiatives and topics. I'll be brief, and because I hope we can get more questions. But I mean, to me, the COVID-19 pandemic has not been in itself an agent of change as much as an accelerator of change. There were a number of trends already in motion, or some very deep forces of transformation, and the pandemic has greatly accelerated them, even if it didn't trigger them. But that really opens a lot of opportunities, and I like the way, Felicia, you're framing the question. Everyone is talking about a new normal, but the challenge is to build a better normal. I do think we have an ethical duty to everyone who suffered so much through this global crisis. And as you said, so compounded by the economic crisis and by all those social inequities that both the pandemic and the economic crisis have brought to the surface in a dramatic way. We owe it to all the victims of this confluence of crisis to actually learn the lessons and build a better normal. So I think this is a very opportune discussion. I mean, clearly, from my perspective as a president of a university, universities have played three fundamental roles in this pandemic. First, for research universities like the University of Miami, we have been the drivers of a lot of the discoveries and then the translation of discoveries that are leading to some of the solutions that we require. On the life sciences side, the discoveries that are leading to better tests, better therapies, and eventually a vaccine. Even as we speak, the University of Miami is one of the sites for the phase 3 trials of the Moderna vaccine. We're also involved in clinical trials from some of the therapies, including the monoclonal antibodies. So that's on the life sciences, but we also carry out the social and behavioral science research that allows us to understand the other big element that we have to respond to the pandemic, which is the human behaviors, whether it's wearing a face cover or keeping social or physical distance, and also to understand the political dynamics that have undermined the effectiveness of some of those public health measures. So universities will continue to play this role, research universities. And one of the important things, I think one of the brightest things that have come out of this pandemic is the level of cooperation from researchers in academia, in government, in private industry, at an unprecedented level that has led to a level of knowledge accumulation in the face of a new pathogen that really has few precedents in the history of humankind. Our challenge is, when we come to the other side, is not to go back to the old practices and to build on that higher plateau of collaboration. And our other challenge is to create permanent platforms, particularly when it comes to the technologies, so that when we face the next pandemic, we don't start again from scratch developing tests, therapies, and vaccines, but create permanent platforms. Our second role as universities in healthcare. Healthcare, those universities like the University of Miami that have a comprehensive medical center, which is our case. We have been on the front lines of the pandemic, and the pandemic has accelerated a number of innovations, the most visible of which has been telehealth. We have, like most medical centers, academic and otherwise, experienced a quantum leap in the amount of telehealth. And I think, again, we need to build on that and make that a permanent feature moving forward. But beyond that, we have been forced, certainly at the University of Miami, to actually run two hospitals, a COVID hospital to take care, and then a hospital that continues to take care for everything else that people continue to suffer. And that piece is absolutely crucial, that we understand how you operate at an enhanced level of efficiency and make some of those changes permanent as well. The other big piece in healthcare, which I think will be most of the focus of the rest of the discussion, is how do we engage globally, both when it comes to developing the preparedness and the response for future emergencies. So I'm not going to talk more about that because I assume that you will be asking questions about that. So finally, our third role, in addition to providing research and in addition to providing healthcare, is what we do in education as an enterprise. And I think the pandemic accelerated in a major way the adoption of technologies that should lead to a much, much improved educational experience. We were able in the spring to achieve in 10 days changes that under normal circumstances would have taken 10 years, as we massively shifted 1,700 courses that were being taught in person to an online format. And it's forced us into an avenue of technological innovation in education that I hope will be permanent as well. So everything that we do is going to be shaped, and we need to seize the opportunity to make sure that what comes after the pandemic is a better normal.
Thank you, Julio. Michael, over to you.
Sure. I think there's a temptation when we're in a situation that we're in now, in the pursuit of optimism, to be using the language of opportunity. And it's certainly the case that crises create opportunities. But I think I would choose to position the question more in terms of stark choices. Whenever you reach a fork in the road and you make a choice, it determines, what direction you're going to take it, the outcome that you're going to have. So, I mean, I think that what we're really talking about right now are existential threats. And first of all, I hope that this crisis, this pandemic, will help to lift public health into the pantheon of issues facing civilization. Things such as climate, poverty, democracy, the situation of women. But I do not think that it's predetermined based on our prior experience that that is going to happen. In fact, if we go on the odds from our previous experience, it's unlikely that it will. But I think that what I would hope would be the opportunity that would come out of this is that is a better understanding of the limits of sovereignty, and that cooperation is actually essential to survival. And I think that in the chaos that we currently see in terms of the lack of coordination of policy, that we're seeing the consequences. And I think, if you needed a more graphic example of how one thing that starts in a far off land, in a city you may not even have heard of, will affect you, this is it.
Mike, I want to let you sort of continue. And the first question that we had, having heard so much about how what was originally in the 80s in Los Angeles, the AIDS hospice organization, and how that evolved into this major global institution that I just read the audience about in your bio. Why has AHF decided now to expand its reach to global public health, and specifically to other infectious diseases in addition to HIV?
Well, I would say, every organization has a mission that it writes down, and et cetera. But I think in most organizations behind that is even something deeper that I would call, not in a religious sense, but an article of faith. And AHF's article of faith from the very, very beginning has been protecting the public health. We consider that a high purpose, a high calling. And so one thing we observed pretty early on was that the countries in the world that had excellent public health systems in place prior to AIDS wound up dealing with it far better than others that did not, right? Also, I would say that as we rolled out our global program in Africa and then around the world, we began to see that, for example, more of our patients died of TB than anything else. I mean, the underlying precondition was HIV, but they weren't dying of advanced AIDS, they were dying of TB. So, of course, we had to deal with that. The other thing we learned was that one of the best ways to intercept people who are HIV positive and didn't know it, maybe weren't seeking HIV testing or treatment, was through STD treatment. And at the end of the day, HIV is an STD. And we have a global epidemic that's been largely ignored of STDs. However, I think what really set us on the path we're on now, in 1914, I wrote a white paper that I presented to our board of directors on the need for a global public health convention. And it grew to a large degree out of the Ebola situation in West Africa. And that touched us very personally because two of our doctors died. One in particular was the only virologist in Sierra Leone. He was, of course, treating patients, the lack of PPE, et cetera. We sought to get him airlifted out, right? Being the resource, the important resource that he was, refused by Germany, by Spain. Eventually, he was accepted to be airlifted by South Africa, but died before that was possible. And it's really where my sort of passion for change at the WHO started as well, because the team landed from WHO unprepared, called us to ask what PPE they ought to use. One of their people became infected and they pulled that team out in its entirety. And also a lot of the other lessons that we learned in that regard, for example, the importance of communication, public communication. the government was not transparent. They gave various different directions and the basic issues about, for example, things like the tradition of washing bodies and explaining to them why they couldn't do that. And also, part of what I've learned, I mean, it's remarkable to me that the United States having the most cases and AIDS Healthcare Foundation being in 16 states, we've not been contacted by a single public health agency asking for our assistance. So not for COVID testing, not to educate patients, zero. And I think that's, you know, a very big shortcoming of the response.
That is a huge shortcoming, and we'll go back to that in a minute with another question that I have just later on for you, Michael. Julio, you have led a very large health system through crises, and especially relevant in this case, through a pandemic. Can you provide your thoughts on why Latin America has become the world hotspot? And we're especially interested in this because, as you know, our Institute for the Americas, for Advanced Study of the Americas, has produced a COVID observatory for Latin America precisely because of it being a hotspot.
Yeah, you know, but first of all, let me just echo what Michael said. Now when we take the global health view of the pandemic, I hope the first big lesson we learn from this is the fact that pandemics are not natural events. They are as anthropogenic as climate change. And now pandemics are fast crises, and climate change is a slower crisis, but they have the same origin. They originate in unsustainable ways in which humans are relating to their environments. And it's both the forces that drive towards climate change and to pandemics, including invasion of habitats, unsustainable ways of producing food in unsanitary, inhumane, promiscuous arrangements for livestock, for poultry, the famous wet markets, all of that which allows some of these zoonoses to jump the species barrier and infect humans. And then with the pandemic, then works on top of that, and with the level of global integration, rapidly spreads throughout the world. And this is why we're seeing an increased frequency of this pandemic since the latter part of the 20th century and certainly into this part of the 21st century. So I completely agree with Michael. I hope one of the things that will be coming real focus is that we cannot continue to relate to the planet in this unsustainable way, not just because of what we're doing to other species, but also in terms of our own survival. And in that sense, I think it's become painfully clear that pandemics are exactly that kind of existential threat that posed by, as deep as the one posed by climate change, and exactly as anthropogenic as climate change. And therefore, it requires our agency and an international collective action to deal with it, just like with climate change. But the other big lesson we've learned, which I think is a remarkable observation, is the huge variation in the performance of national governments. Even though this is a global crisis that requires global response, it is built on the national responses. This is a typical local process. It is global because of the way it spreads, but it then requires a robust local response. And to me, the most amazing feature of this pandemic is the variation where countries, you know, they're dealing with exactly the same virus. We are all the same human species. And yet countries at the same level of development, with the same level of investment in health, have had this incredibly varying performance in terms of the effectiveness of their responses. And what I see is two patterns, and I don't think we can claim anything like a cause and effect relationship, but we've certainly seen two remarkable patterns in the variation in the effectiveness of the response. There is one pattern characteristic of the worst responses. And that, what we see there as a pattern is an over-representation of governments led by populist leaders. And this happens throughout the world, whether it's Russia or Turkey or Hungary or the Great Britain. It doesn't have a populist government, but certainly has a populist prime minister, or with many features of that. And then when you come to the Americas, you happen to have this unfortunate coincidence of the three largest countries, all of them federal countries, all of them with populist governments. And I think that, to me, because I don't think it's a different virus, I don't think it's bad, it's a natural process. I don't think it's different geographies. I think the huge element to me that explains the variance and the concentration of cases is the fact that these three large countries have that feature in common, that political feature. Why? Because there is a populist syndrome that has a number of commonalities, and you see that across the three countries. First of all, not just a distrust, but an active effort to discredit the opinion of experts, to contradict and discredit the opinion of experts. You see it in the three countries. An undermining of science as a guide to public policy, equivocal communication, and then finally, the politicization of public health measures, like wearing a face covering. It's become a political issue. And it all derives from this commonality in the populist syndrome of identifying, of focusing on defining who's the other, and then quickly blaming the other for whatever ills happen, including blaming them for the failure of the leadership in those countries. Unfortunately, that is leading to a very worrisome trend toward an anti-globalization discourse, blaming the foreigners, blaming the Chinese, blaming people who move, migrants, etc. Those are the commonalities, and to me they explain. Now, let me say the other interesting pattern characterizes the best responses in the world. And there the striking pattern is that you have an over-representation of governments led by women, which have had a much more balanced approach, basically trusting experts, following the guidelines of science to inform public policy, and have done incredibly well. I mean, you compare the responses of the US, Brazil, or Mexico with Denmark, or New Zealand, or Germany, and you just find an amazing contrast. Again, I'm not saying it's a cause and effect relationship. I am saying that there are these patterns. But in answer to your question, I think that that's a big explanation. Now, on top of that, of course, you have structural issues. You have, a lot of underinvestment in some of the weakest health systems of the region. But the three countries that I'm talking about had relatively robust resources. They all had really top, globally recognized agencies devoted to epidemiologic surveillance, the CDC, the equivalent bodies in Mexico and Brazil. And yet the action of those bodies has been undermined by the tendency by what I describe as this populist syndrome. So again, I don't want to sound reductionist, but I think any response for accounting for why Latin America is the region of the world, or the Americas, I would add, because I would include here the US, with the worst performance, this factor has to be included in that explanation.
I know that you began to give us some lessons that are really key for the current syndemic from HIV/AIDS, but I wanted to give you more chance to elaborate on that, because perhaps if others haven't rung up to ask for your advice, knowledge, and help in meeting the challenges of COVID-19, I know that the University of Miami is a collaborator, and certainly all of those listening are very interested in understanding that. Can you run us through in a little bit more detail what you would think are the lessons learned?
Well, I would start with transparency, or another way of saying that is honesty. I think that at the beginning of HIV, there were not forthright statements about, what the risks were and what the precautions that needed to be taken were, and the like. So you really had you had in the United States a situation where the president of the United States didn't mention the word AIDS for many years, and you had a stigmatization where people were trying basically to say if it applied to this group and not that group, then we didn't have to pay attention to it, that type of thing. So I think that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is we're attracted to magic bullets, right? So I remember very vividly, and it actually, I believe took place at the University of Miami, the declaration that there would be a vaccine within 1 year for HIV. Okay, now, of course, it's 40 years later. And I think, for example, the discussion about vaccine is misguided. It will not be a magic bullet. First of all, it will not protect everyone who takes it. Second of all, not everyone will be willing to take it. And the rollout will be something beyond anything we've ever seen in the world. You're talking about 7.5 billion people. It would take 8,000 747 planes packed with vaccine to get to everyone that needed it. And if it needs to be refrigerated at sub-freezing temperatures, that's going to make it that much more difficult. Not to mention production of 7.5 billion vials and syringes, and if it requires two things. So, I mean, I'm not denigrating the importance of a vaccine or not saying that we shouldn't have massive investment in it. I'm simply saying is that it's only one potential weapon in the armament. I mean, so because we focus so much on the vaccine, I don't believe we put enough resources into treatment. And with HIV, what you saw was that, people were not anticipating at the beginning that treatment would be the big thing. But that's exactly what it's turned out to be. And now we're even using drugs for treatment as preventatives. Particularly, we've seen one of the greatest accomplishments in HIV has been the prevention of mother-to-child transmission, right? Through the use of a medication as a treatment. But also, I mean, the other analogy with HIV is, the lowly piece of latex, the condom, is still the most important preventative of HIV and STDs. And we have billboards around the country that it says protection. It has a rubber glove, it has a condom, and it has a mask. And so this lowly piece of technology called a mask is the most important preventative that we have. And I'll say that, one thing that's unfortunate is that prevention doesn't have a constituency. And we really don't like to think about prevention very much, right? So I'm saying is, for example, the millions of people who are being treated for HIV, they are a constituency that's going to fight to make sure that HIV treatment remains available, right? But the person who's not infected, even if they're at risk, is not thinking about prevention, et cetera. So I think that we have to go back to the classic public health approach, right? Which is, is prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and isolation. I mean, that's the thing that's interesting is that we have had all these diseases, right? Public health threats, and they're wildly different. And yet the basics of public health work in every instance. I mean, if we applied basics of public health to Ebola, to Zika, to HIV, to swine flu, any of these things, then we would have improvement or a solution.
Michael, thank you. That was incredibly helpful. And I think some of it is sort of at the heart of why I keep thinking that we're speaking about a pandemic, because there's no vaccine against poverty or inequity or gender discrimination. And that, of course, relates back to what Julio was saying about pandemics being anthropogenic. I want to turn now to our global health panorama. And Julio, ask you, what global health lessons have we learned? How do they apply to both our health-focused institutions like the World Health Organization, but also I would love to hear your thoughts on international bodies, international financial institutions like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. What role can they play, and where do you see global health going?
This is the global health moment. I mean, because of the depth and extent of damage that this pandemic has created, it has finally, grabbed the attention of the policymakers in other spheres, in the spheres of finance, the national leaders. One of the frustrations that those of us working in global public health have always had is with previous pandemics or public health emergencies of international concern, is that there's a lot of attention, whether it's SARS or Ebola or avian flu or swine flu, H1N1 in 2009, a lot of attention. But then as soon as the acute phase of the emergency is over, we quickly go back, not even to a new normal, we go back, forget a better normal, we go back to the old normal, the traditional neglect. Because Michael was saying there's no constituency for prevention. There's no constituency for all of that, which is the invisible part of health systems, which is the public health foundation, where you're dealing with surveillance. What people never see is the hundreds of thousands of outbreaks that were prevented because we did the investments in good surveillance. We see the outbreaks that happen, and then quickly it goes out of sight. Well, I think we are at a pivotal moment where we can break out of that vicious cycle where we were, where there was neglect that led to emergencies, an increase in attention, and then back to the neglect because of the extent of damage, with an infinitesimal part of what's been lost by the economy. Forget human lives, of what's been lost by the economy. The world could fund many times over the kind of permanent capability we need to be better prepared. We could fund some of the technological platforms I was talking about, so that as soon as you sequence a genome of a novel pathogen, of which we will have more, you quickly start producing the diagnostic tests, and you don't have the delays we had, which was so devastating when you deal with a virus like this one. You start producing the therapies and you start working on the vaccine. You would fund that. You would fund, I think, a permanent response, rapid response force that would allow to quickly mobilize, especially in places with low response capacity, and quickly try to contain pandemics at the early stages. And then, and those are things where I think there is a consensus and a willingness. But the deeper reform that has to happen is a reform in terms of the governance. I don't think it's enough. I mean, I think the idea of platforms and a quick response force are all very good. And I think we, again, with a fraction of what's been lost in the economic crisis triggered by the pandemic, we could fund those. But the hardest task ahead of us is really to take a hard look at governance. And particularly, we really need to actively combat the temptation to, which we're already seeing by some of these nationalist populist leaders, of quickly saying, you see, this is the problem with globalization. We're exposed to all of these threats from the outside. Let's isolate ourselves. Let's withdraw from WHO. Let's undermine even more the multilateral system. Instead of that, we need to really now move forward with some of the reforms that are required. And again, this is the value of this exercise that Jorge Saavedra and Jose Spongnik, with a lot of partner organizations from many parts of the world have launched in the sense of proposing a new global health convention. We do need a new global compact. And to me, the key issue is to address, again, Michael sort of pointed that out in his opening remarks. It's what I call this sovereignty paradox. We live in a world that is politically organized around sovereign nation states. And the paradox arises because in a world of sovereign nation states, the health of people is the responsibility of national governments. That's why I was saying, even if we think of a global response, you need to have effective national responses. Yet, both the determinants of the health of those populations that are the responsibility of national governments, both the determinants of the health and the nature of the response is such that not even the most powerful and richest country by itself can fully discharge that responsibility to preserve and protect the health of its own population. And that is the rationale for international collective action. And we need to relaunch that idea that no country alone can control either the determinants or the response to some of these shared threats. And the pandemic has just laid that bare, but it's not the only crisis. I think, we find almost any global health crisis, certainly the AIDS pandemic, which is the longest running pandemic, for 40 years we have been under this pandemic, has brought that to light. So we need to revitalize the idea of international collective action, and that requires new forms of governance, where we truly can apply or implement, realize in practice the concept of shared sovereignty. We're not asking governments to give up sovereignty, it's to share their sovereignty in the pursuit of common goals, including the protection of their own populations for which they are responsible from common threats. Now, what would that look like? There's many ideas, but one that I think is prominent is we cannot do that with the current architecture. We have an agency, WHO, which requires a lot of reform, but most of the proposals for reforms have centered on the Secretariat. And every time there's been a public health emergency of international concern of a pandemic, there's a lot of recommendations, and some of them are good, some of them have been implemented. I think the Secretariat was better prepared for this pandemic than for, let's say, Ebola. But, reforming the Secretariats is just one part of the equation. WHO is an organization of sovereign member states. And equally important is to reform the way the sovereign member states behave. That's part of the problem. And in particular, I think the member states need to agree to subject themselves to the scheme of incentives and sanctions, positive incentives and sanctions that create the capacity to actually enforce the international health regulations, like we do with the World Trade Organization. We do need, there's an idea of creating an incentive, an insurance scheme that would probably be managed by the World Bank to neutralize the negative incentive right now against epidemiologic transparency, because every country that declares an outbreak immediately suffers the economic consequences. This is what happened with Mexico in 2009 with the H1N1. And we need to protect Mexico. Is a sufficiently large economy that it could absorb that. But there's a powerful incentive now to not comply with the requirement of the IHRs for timely reporting. So not everything is sanctioned. Some of these could be insurance mechanisms and positive incentives for transparency and cooperation.
I want to stay on the global health ideas, which are so important. I just want to mention to our audience again that upon your registration, you were given a link to send questions. I can tell you that we have people from all over the world, and someone in particular has written in from the Cayman Islands, for example. So please send us your questions. We'll be getting to that in 1 minute. And while people are sending in their questions, Michael, one last one on global health, which is that you have been insisting that the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and malaria should be expanded to deal with pandemics. Why are you focusing on the Global Fund as such an important entity in this case?
Sure. It's a highly successful institution. It is the most successful global health institution that we have. And the reason for that is it has a clear mission. It has a working executive structure that includes accountability. It has an excellent governing structure. It has a board, not like the board of WHO, which has 193 members. And at that table is represented civil society, the donor countries, the recipient countries, business forces, et cetera. So I think it works very well from that point of view. The other benefit is WHO, most of their funding is earmarked, meaning the donor decides how the money goes. So therefore, the institution is following the lead of the donor rather than the institution telling the donor what it needs. In fact, no structure that's based on donations will work, because then it becomes too politicized. I mean, I can't say that the Global Fund is completely depoliticized, but I think in relationship to many other global institutions, it's relatively not politicized. Also, to the point that you were making, Julio, Global Fund mostly operates on the basis of incentives, in the sense that it gives money based on plans that are submitted. But in a sense, it also relies on sanctions, because when a country is not accountable, is wasting money, involved in fraud, it withdraws those funds, and then that means that the country itself has to cover those costs. So I think that's perhaps a good model for incentives versus penalties. But most of all is that it has a focus on infectious disease, and taking what it's learned and growing that to pandemic response and to other infectious diseases, to me, would not be a heavy lift. And since we can't take forever reforming other institutions or coming up with new solutions, we ought to take the institution that has served us the best in this regard and utilize it to the maximum degree possible. And from what I've read, there's an openness there to doing that.
Okay, so this is all part of Build Back Better, and also some very interesting and important opportunities for our world. We have some great questions and comments. I do want to say that one person wrote in, I'm not sure who was, and said that they want to volunteer and how. And so I'm going to assume that goes over to you, Michael, and we can maybe put something on screen that will tell that. And I bet you can contact Jorge Saavedra, and he will answer that. I'm sure we'd be delighted to have more support, and it's wonderful that our audience is thinking about this. We have one question that's quite specific to the Americas. And Julio, I wonder if I can take a little bit of it, but basically they're saying, what are the policies that have been enacted in particular countries like Uruguay and Costa Rica, where COVID-19 cases remain particularly low? What are examples that we could take from those two countries for the hemisphere? Could they be replicated globally?
Well, I mean, you lead the observatory. I think you're the best person to answer that question.
Well, I'm not in Uruguay or Costa Rica, so I can suggest people that would be amazing at this. Replicable, one thing is small countries, it's different. But I think, and really I would turn to both of you, but there are certain lessons that we know, right? We know exactly, as Michael said, put on your mask, do it properly. There are certain basics of public health. We know that we want test. We want contact tracing. We like to get to a point where countries in the Americas are actually managing brotes, are managing outbreaks rather than managing whole-scale shutdown. But I think we can do another session on that if Jorge agrees, or we focus just on what we know from the observatory. But in fact, those two countries have a lot of lessons that they can send us, they can share with us, although they are small countries and it is harder. And we need to think at the subnational level in countries like Brazil, Mexico, the United States, even Canada. Then we have any suggestions on how we build a movement for this type of a global health platform that you're both speaking about? And which of the two of you might like to speak to that?
And you what? Sorry, I didn't remember.
So I think our audience is hearing both of you talk about that there's a job. The question literally says, any suggestions on how we build a movement for this type of global health platform? I think for those of us listening, we're hearing that the two of you coming together with your messages amounts to a new global health platform. Oh. And so that's what I'm, I would
say this, I mean, I think that the scientific community has to be much bolder and much louder. And I know that that's not their natural bent, being, researchers and academics. But in a world where science is under attack the way that it is now, and where, health and scientific policy is being ignored or trashed, I think that there are multiple medical institutions across the world, globally, but also in individual countries that have to speak out. And to the degree that we can organize them either through what's happening for the Global Public Health Convention at University of Miami or through national efforts, it's no guarantee that will prevail over, as what Julio was talking about populist leaders, but it's been faint. And I think that one of the things that should be looked at too is, I think that some of the research process has been compromised by sort of people, seeking to be talking heads on television or announcing scientific, been peer reviewed. So I think that if we can move away from the publicity machine to more thoughtful comments and statements by scientific community. I mean, again, it's not a panacea, but I think that if you think about all the Tower of Babel that we've had, the American Academy of Science, the Public Health Society in Mexico, all these institutions have barely been heard.
Julio.
Yeah, and I think when we use the word platform, I used it in the context of having ready-made platforms for the technological piece. But, tests, therapies, and vaccines, because, we now have the capacity to sequence the genome. There'll be other novel pathogens. And we need to quickly turn on the machine to start producing the tests, the therapies, and the vaccines. There's another set of platforms, which is the evidence about what works, what doesn't work. We have had this natural experiment, if you will, of huge variation across countries. If everyone had done well or everyone had done bad, there would be little to learn. But because there's so much variation, we got to apply those lessons. I identified two patterns in terms of political leadership, but in the sense I'm being provocative. I'm not saying it's the only thing we can learn, but it's certainly, this should have a huge, huge lesson that, political figures ignore science at their peril and at their people's peril. And just accumulating the evidence of what accounted for such a diverging effectiveness of response is going to be very important. The third platform is the institutional platform that we need in terms of global governance. I do think that the pandemic has placed such a spotlight on the grave implications of global health risks to the economy and to national security, that it is, in a sense, it's escaping the boundaries of WHO. So there's been proposals to develop some mechanism, either a sort of global health security council, a parallel to the Security Council at the UN, but something at the level of the entire multilateral system that convenes other actors. That's one level. I think that is a good idea if it's going to enhance the visibility and the resources devoted to better preparedness and response. And then we need to deal with the specialized organizations, with WHO. WHO is what we have. It requires a lot of reform, but it requires reform of the Secretariat for sure. There's much to improve, but of the member states. The fact that you have this dire financial situation where because member states refuse to pay their contributions, their mandatory contributions, or refuse even to adjust for inflation, the magnitude of that is what's left WHO dependent on voluntary contributions for 80% of its revenue. That's no way of running a global organization. This is equivalent to having, let's say, the FDA doing its regulatory work at the national level, depending on the voluntary donations of the very industries that it needs to regulate. It doesn't work. And we need to call people in every country, need to call their governments to account. They need to fund through mandatory contributions a real global health agency, which is the WHO, greatly strengthens, and with the instruments, both incentives and sanctions, to actually protect people. This is no longer about the politicians making the derogatory comments. This is about the health and lives and the livelihoods of millions of people, and it's about national and global security. So I think we need to escalate the level of pressure on national governments to be responsible global citizens.
So we have a call to academia, we have a call to citizens, including, of course, in the United States, a call to everyone to vote. I can't miss the opportunity to say how important that is. As a Canadian, please vote in the United States. But we have one last question that I really think is a jewel. And then maybe at the same time, if you have any closing remarks, and then we'll end our session on time. But the question is, are there any lessons from the social sciences on how one can influence public behavior and direct it to listen to more to the science than to the populist leaders and their conspiracy theories? Michael, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, AHF devotes a tremendous amount of money and energy into social marketing. And social marketing has been a critical element of HIV prevention, for example. So I think that's an area, I mean, if you think about the sciences of marketing and how it pinpoints the individual constituencies, as well as just, basically a form of sort of thought control, if you want to put it that way, I think that there are ways that can be utilized in a positive way for health promotion. That's one area. And I think also that we have to deal with the human being holistically, meaning that there are issues beyond their physical health, right? There is their mental health, there is their place in society. In cases, there are issues regarding drug abuse and other things of that nature. So I think, it's hard to do that in the middle of a pandemic, but I think we need to deal with the social determinants of health. But my final comment is really to emphasize the public in public health. What distinguishes public health is it's dealing with population-based illnesses and issues, but also it relies upon mobilizing public attitudes and opinions. And that's something that we have to do a far, far better job at, or we will never have success in controlling disease. Some of the smaller nations that are being referred to, the people there actually are willing to follow the direction that the government gives them, right? And that's part of why they have succeeded. They may have some gripes or distrust in some areas, but generally speaking, they believe that what's being told to them is for their best interests.
Yeah, I very much agree, and I think it is a great question. That's why I mentioned it's in my initial remarks. There's the advances in science, in the life sciences, but equally important are the social and behavioral sciences. There is a lot we need to take as lessons from here. One thing that's clear is better understanding of some of those drivers coming from social marketing, from behavioral economics, What does it take to nudge people to adopt behaviors that are in their own self-interest and in the interest of others? And we have seen actually in many parts of the world, and you know, people actually coming together and following the rules. I think the issue here has been the equivocal communication strategies of leaders, which have confused by politicizing, by sending contradictory messages, by contradicting the experts. I think they've created this appropriate environment for people to engage in conspiracy theories or to rationalize their own behaviors by saying that they will not wear a mask because that's an infringement on their civil liberties. I think, you know, the application of some of the insights from the social sciences have to go to understanding human behavior, but also in crafting more effective communication policies and practices by leaders. And in the countries that have performed worse, what we see is a massive failure of leadership. And I think we need to learn from that to prevent it. Because in the end, one of the big victims of this pandemic is trust. And there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of second guessing, a lot of doubting, and a lot of that has been driven from the top political figures. And that itself erodes trust in government and trust in international organizations. And that's a pathway that leads to very dark corners. And human history, unfortunately, is full of those reactions after big disasters like a pandemic. So we got to be very cautious and learn also from history, not to follow the path of what happened after some other, 100 years ago, shortly after the great influenza pandemic, we saw the rise of fascism. And we know that script. It would be unforgivable if 100 years later, people and civil society do not learn the lessons to prevent something similar happening now, because that truly would be an even greater catastrophe than the one that we have faced so far. On the contrary, if we leverage the positive lessons, the huge promise of science, the way we've made progress in this pandemic, and the enormous reservoir of solidarity that still binds humans together, I think we will truly build that better normal that I think we're all yearning for.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you, Michael. I'll just end by saying that exactly this is an opportunity to actually cooperate, to work together in ways that we've almost never seen before in academia and research. I think we've probably never seen before in advocacy. It's not the time to advocate for your own disease. It's time to advocate for a safer, healthier world for all. We are very much looking forward as our University of Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas to continue to partner with the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, with you, Michael, and Jorge, with you at our Global Health Institute and our Miller School of Medicine, and also, of course, with IAPAC. It's been an amazing, amazing opportunity to listen to both of you. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has as well. We know we'll make this video available through our Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas and through AHF, I'm sure, as well. And we look forward to seeing you very soon in our future events. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Julio. Thank you, Michael. And have a wonderful and safe afternoon and rest of the week.
Thank you.